Okay, for this project, we're going to be learning about something that's sort of 3D, but kind of not. We call this 2.5D animation. And basically what it means is we're going to be animating flat two-dimensional objects like images and videos, but moving them in three-dimensional space. So here's a quick review of the lecture. You should have a folder that has the Gear Adobe Illustrator file in it. Then I've made a new After Effects file. I'm going to save it right away into that folder. I'm going to call it just Gear. That's okay. And now let's import the gear. All right, I'm going to import it as, I can import it as a composition. That's fine. I'll have it create a composition for me. Here we go. Now I've got gear and gear layers there. I'm going to make a brand new composition to put everything on. I'll call it stage. And we'll set it to either 1920 by 1080 if you have a newer computer, or 1280 by 720 if you have an older computer, because 3D is going to really push the computer to its limits. I'm going to set the duration to be 10 seconds. So now I've got the stage comp. I'm going to drag the gear comp down onto it. And I'm going to scale it down, transform it down to about 40%. Okay, next step. I want the gear to rotate over the course of this animation, one full rotation. So I'm going to drag my playhead back to the beginning, keyframe rotation, drag it all the way to the end, another keyframe, but this time I'm going to set it to be 1 times 0, 0, 0, or one full rotation plus no extra degrees. Looks like nothing's happened, but if I scrub it back, I can see I get one full rotation. If you ever want to test this, play it from the end, and if it loops perfectly smoothly going back to the beginning, you know you did it right. Okay, so far this is just a review. Now things are going to get interesting. We're going to take this 2D layer and turn it into a 3D layer, so you want to find your little 3D icon here. If it's not showing, you might need to hit the toggle switches in modes. If you've been playing with track mats, that might be showing. So flip it back, turn on the 3D layer, and now everything changes. We actually have a 3D layer here with lights and cameras and everything else. Okay, one thing that you'll notice right off the bat is our transform has changed. Instead of just rotating, it's rotating around a specific axis now, rotating around the Z rather than the X or the Y axis. The other thing I'm going to do right now at the beginning is turn on this new option called Draft 3D. And what that'll do is it'll give us a really low-res, quick preview of anything we're doing in 3D. This is the best mode to work in when you're doing your project. But remember, there's limitations, and a big one we're going to run into later is that when you're in Draft 3D, you're not going to see shadows. So if you want to see the shadows, you have to turn this off. This setting over here for the renderer, leave that on Classic 3D. Okay, so we've made a 3D layer. How do we know it's a 3D layer? Well, a quick way to see that is to go up here and grab the Orbit tool. And if you remember from Dimension, this is going to look very similar. We can spin around and we can see our object in 3D. I'm going to undo that and reset everything back to where we were. That's pretty important. Okay, next step, let's create another 3D object, a sort of background to go with this. So I'm going to go to the Layer menu, choose New Solid Layer. I'm going to make a yellow layer. Click OK. I'm going to drag it underneath the gear layer. I'm going to call it, whoops, didn't mean to do that. I'm going to call it, oh, for goodness sake. I'm going to call it Backdrop. There we go. Okay, so far it doesn't look like anything's happened. We have the gear, we have the backdrop. Something interesting though, if I grab the Orbit tool now and spin this, what's happening? The gear is spinning, but that background is staying perfectly yellow no matter what we do. It's almost like that yellow isn't attached to the 3D world we're in. It's sitting behind it, and no matter what we do, it's like a big painted wall that never goes away. Again, I'm going to undo this, and a quick way to get it back too, if you mess it up, is to just go back to active camera default. And if you ever really mess things up, you can go down to reset default camera and it'll put it back to where we were. Okay, so let's talk about this yellow backdrop that's not moving. That's because it doesn't live in the same dimension, three-dimensional dimension that the gear is living in. So let's switch that over. I'm going to go to the backdrop. I'm going to turn on 3D, and now things get really, really weird. Like we get half a gear. What in the world is going on? Well, what's happening is that the gear and the yellow plane, it's now two-dimensional plane in 3D space, they're living in exactly the same spot. And when After Effects goes to render this, it can't quite decide whether to show us the gear or the yellow background, so we get some weird mix of the two of them. To fix that, we can push the yellow layer back in space. So let's do that. An easy way to do that is to switch our active camera view. So I'm going to switch it to custom view 1. And here you can sort of see the problem. The gear and the yellow backdrop are in the same space. But if we go to our backdrop, we go to transform, and I go to position, you'll see position now has 3 properties, X, Y, and Z. And if I crank up the Z position, I'm going to end up pushing it back in space. In fact, I'm going to push it back to about 300, somewhere in there. It doesn't matter too much. Get it close to 300. And now if I grab the orbit tool, you can see that the gear and the backdrop have separated, and now we're not getting that weird rendering problem. So one thing I want to point out here that I didn't mention before is that by creating 2 3D layers that live right next to each other without a non-3D layer in between them, as long as they're next to each other, you can even kind of see they're linked. This is called a 3D bin, and that means that those 3D layers are going to exist in the same universe. If I, for example, put another solid color layer in between them, but it wasn't 3D, then I would have 2 separate 3D universes that didn't interact. Okay, so let's get our, go back to our default camera here. And things look pretty good, except, I don't know if you can tell, but we're seeing edges on the sides of the yellow backdrop. And that's because in pushing it back in space, we made it smaller. I want it to actually fill everything up. So I'm going to go to the backdrop, and I'm going to go to scale, and I'm going to crank that up so it's much, much larger. And now, through this particular camera's point of view, it's filling the whole backspace. Okay, next step, let's make these things interact. What I want to do is I want to create a light that's going to cast a shadow from the gear onto the solid color yellow backdrop behind it. To do that, we're going to need a couple things. We're going to need some lights. So let's create a light first. I'm going to go up here to Layer, New, and this time I'm going to go over and choose Light. And I'm going to have a bunch of different light options. The one I want is a spotlight. Now these settings are going to be pretty important for what we do, so you might want to freeze it here once I have these set to make sure that yours match. So I'm going to set the intensity of the spotlight to 50%. That's important. The fall off distance, I'm going to crank that up. I'm going to set that to be about 1,000. This controls how quickly the light dies away from this particular bulb. I'll set the fall off to smooth. Cast shadows definitely needs to be turned on. I'm going to set the shadow darkness to 75%, and let's do the shadow diffusion to 10%. And then I'll click OK. We get something like this. It's kind of hazy and dark. I'm going to save it here before I go any further. And we're certainly not seeing any shadows cast yet. So the second thing we need to do is by creating a light, we've told After Effects that this is a universe that has lights in it. Before, there was light, random light coming from everywhere. It didn't really care about it. But now that we've created one specific light, now it follows the rules of that light. And that light is one lonely flashlight shining in a deep, dark void. So let's add like a sun. When we're creating a general light, a light that's not a specific flashlight, spotlight, something like that, a light that seems to be coming from everywhere all at once, that's known as an ambient light. It doesn't point in any particular direction. So I'm going to go up to Layer, New. I'm going to choose Light. And this time I'm going to create an ambient light with an intensity of 50%. Now things look a whole lot better. We can see that the ambient light has brightened up the whole room, the whole universe, but our spotlight is still focused on this area right here. We're not seeing shadows, though, and you might be wondering why. Well, this is going to happen a lot, and here are the things that I would check in order. First, am I in the draft 3D mode? If I am, I'm going to click that to turn it off. Very important. Next thing, let's check our objects. So our gear, I'm going to drill down into the material objects, and I'm going to see, is this thing, this gear, do we want it to actually cast shadows on other things in After Effects? By default, After Effects is going to assume no, because casting shadows takes a lot of processing power and slows things down. So it only makes shadows when you specifically tell it to. Let's turn it on, and there we go. So those two things right off the bat, turning off Draft 3D and turning on Cast Shadows for the gear, are very important. There's a third thing that we could check as well. We could look at our backdrop, and again, if I go to Material Options, I don't need it to cast shadows, but I do need to make sure that Accepts Shadows is on. This one, Accept Shadows, tends to be on by default for most things that you make, but not always. So again, if you're not getting shadows, check Draft 3D, make sure that your light and your object are set to cast shadows, and then whatever you're casting them onto, make sure that's set to Accept Shadows. Let's save it here now. So we're going to dig into this a lot more coming up, but you've probably jumped ahead already and are imagining all the things that we can do with this. And that's because pretty much every property that you can set in After Effects can be animated. So let's just pick one of them. Really easy. Let's try transforming our spotlight. So I'm going to go to Transform, and you'll see this has things like rotation options and orientation. But there's also an option up here called a point of interest. And this is, imagine, this is different than the position of the light. The position of the light is, say, us holding a flashlight. Point of interest is what is our flashlight pointing at. We can move that just by resetting these values. So for example, if I drag this one all the way off to the left, what I'm essentially doing is pointing my flashlight way off to the left. And you know what? I probably should have had my playhead all the way at the beginning, but it doesn't matter because I hadn't keyframed it yet. So let's add a keyframe there. Now let's go to the end here. Let's crank our point of interest way off to the right. Okay, so there's a lot going on here now if you think about it. What is After Effects going to render? First of all, it's going to render the gear. It's going to rotate the gear. It's going to render the backdrop. It's going to render lighting, two kinds, an ambient light that's going to set the general light in the room, and a spotlight that's going to cast a light onto the gear and then cast a shadow onto the backdrop. We can put all this together and let it play. Now, keep in mind, the more complex you make your 3D, the longer it's going to take for it to render out. You can see that mine is still working here, but I'm going to just play it out here and let's see what it looks like. Well, it's going pretty quick. Easy, right? Not too tough. Remember, 3D can get complicated, but an easy way to wrap your head around it when you get stuck is to try switching cameras. So if I switch to custom view 1, now we're going to play this back. You're actually going to see that spotlight turn as I scrub it. And it makes a big cone, and that's the cone of light that it's casting on the backdrop as we go.